In this podcast, we will be analyzing Charles Whitman's case in regard to his personality through the biological and behavioral perspective. Starting off, we have the biological perspective, where the discussion will center around the biologic theory, which explores the biological base of personality, including the role of heredity, the brain, and evolution. And when applying this to Charles, one explanation of his behavior focuses on the brain, where he was found to have a brain tumor. One could therefore argue, according to the biological perspective, that Whitman only had limited control of his actions as a consequence of his brain damage. Because during his autopsy, which was made to follow up on his reference to intense headaches, Whitman was found to have a brain tumor the size of a walnut in the hypothalamus region of the brain, which biologists hypothesize put pressure on the amygdala, which is responsible for the regulation of emotion and aggression, where it, among other things, mobilizes the body for action, readying it for flight or fight. His brain tumor then may have played a major role in the cause of him committing these murders, as it could have been a predisposing factor that lowered his inhibitions against violent behavior. And when looking at the link between Whitman's brain and behavior, one can argue that as his tumor grew and put pressure on his amygdala, his personality and behavior changed. From research, one can read about him being described as a perfectly normal person, who was academically successful as well as perceived as a polite and kind person. However, much research also shows that he recently before the killings showed clear signs of personality change, such as anger issues and lack of empathy, which Whitman himself even seemed to acknowledge, as he clearly addresses this in his letter, along with describing his intense headaches. Okay, so moving on. When looking at the case from a behaviorist perspective, factors like heredity, the brain, and evolution are not included, as the behavioral perspective argues that Whitman's personality and behavior is a product of previous learning experiences and the culture in which grew up, only taking external environmental factors into consideration and not any science. Starting off, in the behaviorist perspective, one theory of personality is social learning, which is based on the cognitive perspective as well as classical learning from the behavioral perspective when looking at operant and classical conditioning. Classical conditioning focuses on the learning through association, and operant conditioning focuses on the method of learning that occurs through rewards and punishment for behavior. However, the theory goes above the fact of learning a certain behavior by just getting a reward and adds that a person's behavior and personality develops by observing the behavior of a role model in the person's life. And this role model is usually someone we can relate and identify with, like a wife, parent, sibling, or a teacher. And this could be applied to Charles' case, as his father was his model in life. So as his father was abusive and aggressive towards Charles and his whole family, he provided an aggressive model during his formative years as a youth. It is also known that his father had a passionate interest in guns and trained Charles and his siblings to use them, and was obsessed by having everything as he wanted. At the same time, Charles was a part of the Marines, which was built on expertise with sniper training, where aggressive behavior and shooting was encouraged by the people around him, also known as differential association. And this, of course, made Charles reinforce behaviors where he was aggressive and violent when being around his father and the Marine, as he observed that type of behavior through his whole life. So, by knowing that our personality is influenced by the things we observe, one could argue that Charles' violent personality and actions of violence originates from observations of his father's way of acting, along with his time in the Marine, which can be backed up by Bandura's doll experiment, where it is shown that a child who sees a model acting aggressively towards the doll also has a higher tendency of acting aggressively towards the doll later on. When incorporating that to Charles, we know that his whole life has been around guns, violent behavior, and aggressiveness, which makes it more likely for him to express the same personality of aggressiveness and behavior towards other people, just like he did during the mass shootings. From this, we can see that the biological perspective only looks at nature, while the behaviorist perspective only focuses on the nurture in regards to personality and its different components. Okay, so now we know the different reasons behind why he might have acted the way he did according to different viewpoints. But what would have happened if he went to visit a therapist within the two different perspectives and asked for help? What treatments and suggestions would they have given him?
Well, according to the biological perspective, the treatment suggested for Whitman would be suggested with palliative therapy, where surgery is the first stage to remove as much of the tumor as possible, and is typically followed by chemotherapy or radiotherapy, which are both treatments used to prevent the tumor from growing.
However, as research showing evidence on him having glioblastoma multiform tumor, known as the most aggressive cancers that begins in the brain, the cancer would most likely recur after treatment despite maximum treatment. Therefore, these suggested treatments might have to be paired with another one, as Whitman would have needed to adapt to live with his brain tumor as long as he would be alive, even though it would be for a very short while, as it would have been very little chance of it going away. Therefore, the second therapy which could have been suggested is symptomatic therapy, which is a medical treatment focusing on relieving symptoms within the patient. So in this case, it would perhaps reduce his physical pain, being his intense headaches. And the drug prescription would then be analgesics, which is a painkiller used to achieve relief from pain.
And why would we say those treatments specifically? Well, these biological treatments would act directly on the biological mechanism that caused or were involved in his mental state, which would be seen as a simplified conduct by other psychological perspectives, as there might be other underlying causes to his personality change and behavior. However, the biological perspective also encompasses heredity and evolution, which both could help explain his mental state, where in short, his violence can stem from his father, who has been described as being an abusive father. Aggression as a personality trait is in fact known as being 44% inherited.
Moreover, one can also explain Whitman's acts of criminality as a result from males' evolved tendency to solve problems with violence, where males have evolved to be violent because violence paid off.
Although the biological perspective has different aspects of approaching reasons to personality trait and behavior, one can argue that biological treatments treat symptoms rather than causes, where the symptoms frequently are thoughts and feelings rather than somatic feelings. However, in Whitman's case, it seems to have been both.
Therefore, only suggesting solutions which treat his brain tumor might not be the perfect solution, as there might have been several factors which played a role causing his outrage.
And as a side note, treatment for cancer has developed a lot in recent years. Therefore, these specific treatments might not have existed at the time Charles Whitman was alive. So once again, the behavioral therapies differ enormously as they ignore biological factors.
Instead, the social learning therapies from the behavioral perspective main goal is to get rid of a maladaptive behavior and replace them with adaptive ones through either changing or preventing a deviant behavior by manipulating social learning processes in things like imitation and reinforcement.
This is done in order to change the individual's way of thinking and the impact their models had on their personality, which can be done through different strategies. But starting off with the first type of therapy, we have modeling therapy. And modeling therapy is used to help and illustrate healthy behaviors that the client can learn by example and practice in sessions with a therapist for those who suffer from anger management and abuse, which Charles did.
Behaviorists argue that personality and behavior is affected by the observation of a model in a person's life, which for Charles was his abusive and aggressive father. In order for the patient to learn how to respond to the behavior from the model in a more socially adaptive behavior than previous, the therapist goes from acting like the model, which has influenced the person's personality, which in this case is Charles' father, into later switching into the role of the observer, where Charles gets to act as the model, being his father.
So for Charles, he has been taught that he is to respond to his father by acting and doing as he says when it comes to being aggressive and to guns. But by visiting a modeling therapist, he would have learned that getting compliments and reinforcements does not have to come from him having to act like his father, as he has been taught. Instead, he could learn new ways of increasing his self-efficacy, where self-efficacy refers to people's judgments about their capability to perform particular tasks. The basic principle behind self-efficacy theory is that individuals are more likely to engage in activities for which they have a high self-efficacy and less likely to engage in those they do not.
For Charles, this could be applied to his life in general, as he constantly has been beaten down by his father and may be more likely to enjoy life and not get vicious thoughts through raising his self-efficacy. Raising self-efficacy is done in a model where the first step is performance outcomes, or past experiences, which are the most important sources of self-efficacy. Positive and negative experiences can influence the ability in how we perform a given task. For Charles, he has always been abused by his father when doing one wrong move, so one could argue that his performance outcomes are low and negative. But as behaviorists believe that behavior and personality can be relearned, his low and negative beliefs can be changed.
Verbal persuasion could be one of the factors which can help Charles raise his self-efficacy and change his negative ideas. This is done through positive environments, which a modeling therapist could provide through encouragement and positive reinforcements, like saying that he is important, needed, loved, and that he does not have to get his father's approval to know that he is good enough. By doing this, Charles could have gained more confidence, which could have increased his self-efficacy and thereby his view on life, and remove himself from violent thoughts as he is introduced to positive ideas.
Getting an emotional arousal based on the things he's doing could also be a factor in changing his attitude and vicious thoughts, as he finally might feel that he is good compared to how he has been raised, where everything he has done has been bad according to his father. But according to Bandura, this step is not the most important one, but rather the verbal persuasion.
Another therapy which might have worked could have been him expressing his aggressive thoughts and violent rushes into creative activities through expressive therapy. There, Charles could have drawn, danced, and exercised his emotions and the things he was feeling in order to become more aware of the emotions, but also expressing them in a less aggressive way. For Charles, doing boxing or intense workout could be a way for him to shake off his violent thoughts into a physical activity where he can express his anger towards a boxing cushion instead of people, along with a therapist next to him triggering him to let everything out.
Okay, so it is clear to see that modeling therapy ignores nature, as it does not mention the fact that aggression, as a personality trait, is in fact known as being 44% inherited, like we said previously. This means that all aggressive and abusive behavior is not something which can be relearned or removed in the same way as you could remove a tumor. Which also means that relearning new behavior does not mean that aggressive components are completely removed from Charles's personality.
Because if they have been a part of his life since he was born, they may reoccur if he is in a situation where he meets a new violent and aggressive model or go near guns, which can re-trigger his violent thoughts. Thereby, the therapy is not a long-lasting one, as triggering situations could occur wherever and make him snatch.
But at the same time, according to the behaviorist perspective, it could be relearned through raising his self-efficacy, which could remove him from always looking at things violently like his father did, as behaviorists argue that behavior which influences our personality can be relearned.
As for the expressive therapy, it is not a long-lasting solution as well, because if he were to get violent rushes 5 times a day, for example, it is hard to always express them through going to the gym or drawing them out, as it becomes repetitive and exhausting to work out 5 times a day. But by combining the behavioral and biological therapies, one could argue that there is a bigger chance of a personality change from violent to less or non-violent, as nature and nurture exponents both can be a reason for an aggressive personality, as we have seen in Charles.
So by removing his tumor and helping him better his self-efficacy, there might have been a smaller chance of him committing the murders.
Okay, so in knowing all of this, what do the two perspectives have to say about the view on Charles as a human and in regard to nature and nurture?
As mentioned before, the biological perspective only takes nature into mind and therefore holds a very deterministic view on the human, and therefore would believe Charles Whitman to be a consequence of his genetics and physiology instead of a product of environmental influences around us or other factors that other perspectives tend to focus more on.
And everything that is psychological must first be physiological according to the biological perspective. The stark contrast between the biological perspective and the most of the other is in the nature versus nurture debate. The biological side would therefore argue that nature is what shaped Charles Whitman the most, and therefore his genetics and bodily functions, where we primarily focused on his brain damage today, was what caused his personality change and behavior.
Nature refers to all of the genes and hereditary factors that influence who we are. This includes everything from our physical appearance to our personality characteristics. For instance, when referring to Whitman's personality and behavior, the biological perspective ignores factors in our everyday environment such as our childhood, friends, family, and media, although self-discipline and a good upbringing might would have helped Whitman to control or redirect his urges. And this could be viewed as a highly reductionist approach, which reduces feelings and reactions to robot-like behavior when additional factors, many of them environmental, could truly help explain Whitman's personality.
Only counting for the biology in this case, it is not more than relevant to question if Charles Whitman then can be held responsible for his crimes, as he was unable to control his biology.
Behaviorism, on the other hand, states that all behavior is learned from the environment through conditioning. Therefore, according to the behaviorist perspective, one could argue that Whitman's personality development has been impacted by environmental factors only through things like his father's abusive behavior, including his time with the Marine and around guns.
However, the behavioral aspect of social learning theory would view Charles Whitman's personality to have been learned, but it can be unlearned through modeling theory and new positive environments where he is separated from aggressive people and guns. This approach can therefore be seen as highly deterministic, as well as it doesn't take nature into consideration and only looks at the nurture aspect and believes that behavior is the only thing which has shaped Charles and his personality.
It can also be viewed as highly reductionist, as behaviorists argue that behavior is the result of stimuli response, where it's argued that all behavior, no matter how complex it might be, can be reduced to a simple stimulus. When taking this into consideration and applying it to Charles, it is too simplified to say that he acted and turned into a killer just because of his environment, as there can be other underlying biological factors, for example, like genes and the fact that he had a brain tumor, which may have played an important role.
To conclude and summarize everything, in many instances, environmental explanations are equally plausible as biological. In Charles Whitman's case, for example, abuse as a child and depression as an adult may have played at least an important role as his brain tumor in participating his homicidal rampage and personality change.
Moreover, his environmental and biological conditions may have interacted. There is much that is environmental about biological variables. For instance, head injuries leading to brain dysfunction are caused by the environment. And also much that is biological about environmental variables, for instance, genetic factors and their biological predispositions, which can contribute to bad parenting. Therefore, we believe that there is not one single acquired condition, such as brain damage, on its own that could have caused this criminal behavior, but rather an interplay among biological and environmental factors.
And that's about it on the case of Charles Whitman from a biological and behaviorist approach, focusing on the brain and social learning theory.
Thank you!
Merci.